Laughter, cruel and unforgiving, tore through the elegant Pierre Hotel ballroom as Cassian publicly humiliated his ex-fiancée. He sneered at her cheap emerald green dress, loudly mocking her plus-sized figure in front of Manhattan's elite. Fiona squeezed her eyes shut, praying to simply vanish from the humiliation. Suddenly, a deafening mechanical roar drowned out the string quartet. Above them, a military-grade helicopter shattered the vaulted glass skylight, and New York's most ruthless mafia boss descended from the wreckage to claim his bride. The gold-embossed invitation had felt like a death warrant the moment it arrived in Fiona Blake's cramped mailbox in Queens. It was an invitation to the engagement gala of Cassian Pierce, the man she had spent 5 years supporting through Columbia Law School, and his new fiancée, Chloe Vanderpump, an heiress to a shipping empire. Fiona had sworn she wouldn't go. She had spent the last 8 months trying to stitch her heart back together after Cassian had packed his bags on a rainy Tuesday, coldly stating that a junior partner at a white shoe law firm couldn't be seen with a baker whose waistline was expanding as fast as her debt. "You're a comfortable stepping stone, Fiona," he had told her, adjusting his tie in the mirror she had bought him. "But you just don't fit into the bespoke life I'm building." Literally. Yet Cassian had called her 3 days ago, his voice laced with that familiar, manipulative warmth. He had begged her to come, insisting it would bring them both closure, claiming he wanted his oldest friend to witness his milestone. Fiona, cursed with a heart that always looked for the good in people, had foolishly believed him. Now, standing in the opulent foyer of the Pierre Hotel on Fifth Avenue, she realized exactly why she had been invited to serve as the punchline to his joke. Fiona tugged nervously at the hem of her dress. It was an off-the-rack emerald green wrap dress she had found on clearance at Macy's for $89. On the mannequin, it had looked elegant. On her soft, plus-sized frame, the cheap polyester blend clung stubbornly to the curves of her hips and stomach, the fabric straining slightly across her generous chest. She had spent 2 hours trying to curl her dark hair and apply makeup, hoping to look dignified, but surrounded by women in custom, Vera Wang, Oscar de la Renta, and dripping in Harry Winston diamonds, Fiona felt like a child playing dress-up in dirty clothes. She tried to blend into the shadows near a towering ice sculpture, gripping a flute of champagne like a lifeline. But Cassian had a predator's radar. Well, I didn't think you'd actually have the nerve to show up," a slick voice sneered. Fiona turned. Cassian stood there looking infuriatingly handsome in a tailored Tom Ford tuxedo. Clinging to his arm was Chloe. Chloe was a vision of sample-size perfection, her sharp collarbones jutting out above a shimmering silver gown that probably cost more than Fiona's annual rent. Chloe's ice-blue eyes scanned Fiona from head to toe, her lips curling into a smile that was entirely devoid of warmth. "Cassian, darling, is this the charity case you told me about?" Chloe asked, her voice carrying just enough volume to turn the heads of the affluent guests nearby. Fiona's cheeks burned. "Cassian invited me," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, though her hands were shaking so violently that her champagne rippled. "I invited you because I thought it would be a good reality check for you, Fiona," Cassian said, taking a sip of his scotch. He looked her up and down, his gaze stopping deliberately on her waist. "And it seems you haven't changed a bit. Still eating your feelings, I see. And that dress." He let out a sharp, barking laugh. "Good God, Fiona. Did you make that out of leftover curtains? You look like a green, upholstered armchair." A few of the guests standing nearby chuckled. The sound was like physical blows. "It's from Macy's," Fiona whispered, the fight draining out of her. She felt enormous. She felt like every inch of her flesh was a target, her thick thighs and round stomach exposed to the cruel scrutiny of Manhattan's elite. "Macy's, Chloe repeated the word as if it were a disease. She leaned in her perfume, something sharp and expensive assaulting Fiona's senses. Listen to me, sweetie. You don't belong here. Look at you. You're spilling out of that cheap fabric. Cassian upgraded. He needed a woman who could fit into high society, not someone who takes up 2 seats on the subway. Run back to your little bakery before you embarrass yourself further. The crowd had gathered now, forming a loose, suffocating circle around the spectacle. The string quartet seemed to fade into the background. Fiona's vision blurred with unshed tears. She had spent years working double shifts, kneading dough until her knuckles bled, paying Cassian's rent, buying his textbooks, feeding him when he had nothing. And this was her reward. Public humiliation. You're right. Fiona choked out the humiliation finally breaking her. I don't belong here. She turned to flee, desperate to find the heavy mahogany doors and escape into the cool night air. But before she could take a single step, the chandeliers above them began to violently shake. The crystal droplets clinked against one another, a delicate sound that was quickly swallowed by a low mechanical thumping. The thumping grew louder, vibrating through the marble floors, rattling the champagne glasses on the silver trays. Cassian frowned, looking up at the vaulted ceiling. What the hell is that noise? It wasn't a noise. It was a roar, the deafening sound of a twin-engine Sikorsky S-76 helicopter hovered directly above the Pierre Hotel. The sheer downdraft from the rotors rattled the massive arched windows of the ballroom. Guests shrieked, covering their ears and dropping their drinks as the glass panes vibrated dangerously in their frames. Suddenly, the heavy reinforced double doors of the ballroom didn't just open, they were violently thrust apart. 4 men stepped into the room. They weren't hotel security. They were built like freight trains, wearing bespoke black Brioni suits that failed to hide the heavy artillery holstered beneath their jackets. They moved with terrifying precision, fanning out and forming a perimeter. The hotel's own security guards rushed forward, but one of the men merely opened his jacket to reveal a matte black submachine gun, and the guards froze, raising their hands in immediate surrender. The ballroom plunged into absolute terrified silence, save for the muffled rhythm of the chopper blades outside. The elite of New York CEOs, politicians, and socialites parted like the Red Sea. Through the corridor of terrified billionaires walked Leonardo Costa. To call him handsome would be a gross understatement. He was devastating. Standing 6'3", Leonardo possessed the kind of dark, ruthless beauty that made people instinctively avert their eyes. His jawline looked as though it had been chiseled from granite, bearing a faint, pale scar that ran from his left temple down to his cheekbone, a brutal reminder of the violent world he ruled. He wore a charcoal 3-piece suit that fit his broad shoulders flawlessly, an Audemars Piguet Royal Oak gleaming on his wrist. He was the head of the Costa Syndicate. He owned half the judges in the state, controlled the docks from New York to Boston, and moved like a panther who had just entered a cage full of domesticated rabbits. Leonardo didn't glance at the politicians he owned or the celebrities who had begged for his favor. His midnight dark eyes swept the room with lethal intent, searching until they locked onto a splash of emerald green. Fiona. Fiona's breath hitched. She recognized him instantly, though not from the tabloids. A year ago, in the freezing rain, she had found a man bleeding out from a gunshot wound in the alley behind her bakery. Without asking questions, she had dragged him inside, locked the doors, and spent 3 hours packing his wounds and keeping him conscious until a black SUV had quietly arrived to take him away. He had never told her his name. She had never spoken of it again. Leonardo walked with deliberate, heavy steps directly toward the center of the room, stopping mere inches from Cassian, who was now sweating profusely, his arrogant sneer entirely gone. Mr. Costa. Cassian stammered, recognizing the Mafia boss from a high-profile racketeering case his firm had desperately tried to avoid. We weren't expecting you. This is a private party." Leonardo ignored Cassian completely. His eyes were fixed entirely on Fiona. The cold, murderous aura surrounding him seemed to soften by a fraction as he took in her tear-stained face, her trembling shoulders, and the cheap green dress she was trying to hide behind her hands. "Who made her cry?" Leonardo's voice was a low, gravelly baritone, but it carried through the silent room like a thunderclap. Cassian blinked, utterly confused. "What her Mr. Costa, she's nobody. Just an ex who crashed the party to cause a scene. We were just asking her to leave." Leonardo slowly turned his head to look at Cassian. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You were asking her to leave. She doesn't fit in here," Chloe chimed in, trying to muster her usual haughtiness, though her voice trembled. "Look at her. She's a mess. She's far too large for that hideous dress, and she—" In a flash of movement so fast it was almost a blur, Leonardo's massive hand shot out, grabbing Cassian by the throat. Cassian choked, his eyes bulging, as the Mafia boss lifted the junior partner 2 inches off the marble floor. Chloe let out a piercing shriek, scrambling backward and tripping over her expensive Vera Wang heels. "Let me make something abundantly clear to you, you pathetic little cockroach," Leonardo whispered, his face inches from Cassian's turning purple visage. "The woman you are speaking about possesses more grace, beauty, and loyalty in her little finger than exists in your entire bloodline." Leonardo tossed Cassian aside like a discarded piece of trash. Cassian hit the ground, hard, gasping for air, clutching his bruised throat. Leonardo turned his back on the gasping lawyer and stepped directly into Fiona's personal space. He reached out his large, calloused hands, gently taking hers. The contrast was stark, his hands instruments of violence, holding hers with overwhelming reverence. "I apologize for being late, Mia Regina," Leonardo said softly, loud enough for only her and the front row of terrified guests to hear. "Leo, what are you doing here?" Fiona whispered, her mind short-circuiting. "I came for you," he stated simply. He turned his head, slightly addressing the room, but never taking his eyes off her. "This woman is under the absolute protection of the Costa family. In fact, she is more than that." Leonardo reached into his tailored pocket and withdrew a velvet box. He didn't drop to one knee, kings didn't kneel, but he flipped the box open to reveal a flawless 10-carat emerald-cut diamond ring that dwarfed the pitiful stone Cassian had just given Chloe. "She is my bride," Leonardo announced, the finality in his tone echoing off the walls, "and if anyone in this room ever looks at her with anything less than absolute worship, I will personally ensure they never open their eyes again." He looked back at Fiona, his thumb gently wiping a stray tear from her cheek. He let his gaze drag over her curvy figure, his eyes burning with genuine, unhidden desire. "And for the record, this dress belongs on the floor of my bedroom. But until we get there, you look utterly magnificent in it." He didn't wait for her to process it. He slipped the heavy cold diamond onto her trembling finger. "We are leaving," Leonardo commanded. Fiona couldn't move. Her feet felt as though they had been glued to the Pierre's imported marble. The sheer weight of the diamond on her left hand anchored her to a reality that felt entirely like a hallucination. "Come," Leonardo said softly, his massive hand shifting from her fingers to the small of her back. The touch was firm, possessive, and surprisingly warm through the thin polyester of her dress. Before she could form a coherent sentence, she was moving. Leonardo guided her toward the shattered double doors. His men instantly collapsed their perimeter, forming a tight, impenetrable shield around them as they moved through the corridor. Fiona cast one final glance over her shoulder. Cassian was still on the floor, his face pale and contorted in sheer terror, while Chloe knelt beside him, sobbing into her hands. The high society elite who had mocked her mere minutes ago were now bowing their heads, too terrified to even meet Fiona's eyes. "Keep your eyes forward, Fiona," Leonardo murmured in her ear, his breath brushing her neck. "They aren't worth your time." They pushed through the exit and into the humid New York night air, rushing toward the hotel's private rear loading area, where an elevator waited. The ascent to the rooftop helipad was a blur. The moment the elevator doors dinged open, the roar of the Sikorsky S-76 hit them like a physical wall. The wash from the spinning blades whipped Fiona's dark hair into a frenzy and plastered the cheap green dress against her thick curves. Leonardo didn't hesitate. He wrapped his arm tightly around her waist, shielding her from the wind, and practically lifted her off her feet to carry her the last 10 yards to the chopper. He helped her inside the opulent cabin. It smelled of rich leather aviation fuel and his expensive cologne. Fiona sank into the plush, cream-colored leather seat. Leonardo climbed in right behind her, taking the seat opposite. The doors slid shut, sealing out the deafening noise, replacing it with a hum as the pilot immediately throttled up. Her stomach dropped as the helicopter lifted off, banking sharply over the glowing grid of Manhattan. Fiona stared out the window, watching the Chrysler Building slip past her heart, hammering against her ribs. She looked down at her hand. The diamond caught the ambient light of the city, glittering mockingly. She finally found her voice. "What did you just do?" Leonardo leaned forward, pouring 2 glasses of Dom Perignon from a small, built-in bar console. He handed her a crystal flute. "I took you out of a room full of vipers. You claimed me. You put a ring on my finger." Fiona's voice pitched up in panic. "I saved your life a year ago. I didn't ask for this. Who are you really? And why did you do that in front of Cassian?" "My name is Leonardo Costa," he said, settling back into his seat, his dark eyes studying her intently. "And I did it because it was necessary, and because I wanted to." Fiona took a desperate gulp of the champagne. The bubbles burned the back of her throat. "Necessary? How is staging a mafia marriage necessary? And how did you even know I was there?" Leonardo's expression darkened. The relaxed, confident aura he exuded shifted into something sharper, something far more dangerous. "I've known where you were every second of every day since you pulled me into your bakery, Fiona. You saved my life. Did you really think a man in my position would just walk away and leave his savior unprotected?" Fiona blinked, her mind racing. "You've been watching me." "I had my men keeping an eye on you," he corrected, though unapologetically. "Watching you work those ridiculous double shifts. Watching that parasite Cassian bleed you dry and then abandon you. I almost killed him the day he left your apartment." "Why didn't you?" "Because you were crying," Leonardo said softly, the brutal honesty in his tone making her shiver. "I didn't want to bring blood to your doorstep when you were already grieving. But things have changed, Fiona. 3 days ago there was a leak in my organization." Fiona frowned, clutching the glass tighter. "What does that have to do with me? The bullet you pulled out of my shoulder a year ago was fired by an assassin working for the Volkov Bratva." Leonardo explained, his voice low and steady over the hum of the rotors. "They've been trying to figure out how I survived that night. They finally found the leak. They found out about the bakery. They found out about you." A cold spike of adrenaline pierced Fiona's chest. "They know who I am." Leonardo nodded grimly. "They know you saved me. In their eyes, that makes you an enemy of the Bratva. A loose end. My men intercepted chatter this morning. They were planning to take you tonight after you left that party. Fiona looked out the window. The city below suddenly didn't look like a beautiful grid of lights. It looked like a hunting ground. So, you crashed the party. You put this ring on me. It's a shield. If I'm the fiancé of a Costa, they can't touch me without starting a full-scale war. Exactly, Leonardo said. Fiona let out a shaky breath, looking down at her plus-sized frame, at the cheap green fabric clinging to her thighs. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. A mafia boss and a fat, broke baker. I'm sure the Russians will completely buy this love story. Before she could take another sip of her champagne, Leonardo leaned across the narrow space between them. He snatched the glass from her hand, setting it down on the console before grasping her chin in his large hand. He forced her to look at him. His eyes were blazing with a sudden intense heat that made Fiona's breath catch. Do not insult yourself in my presence again. Leonardo growled, his voice a dark velvet rumble. You think I give a damn about the skeletons in that ballroom? You think I prefer women who look like they'd snap in half in a stiff breeze? Women who starve themselves for the approval of men like Cassian. He leaned closer, his thumb tracing the soft line of her jaw trailing down to the pulse beating frantically at her throat. I've been watching you for a year, Fiona. I've watched the way you move. I've watched the way you smile. I watched you tonight wearing this green dress, and it took every ounce of restraint I had not to tear it off you the moment I walked into that room. Fiona's lips parted, her cheeks flushing a deep, fiery red. No man had ever spoken to her like this. Cassian had always made her feel like a burden, like something he had to hide or apologize for. Leonardo looked at her, as if she were a feast he had been starving for. The engagement is a tactical move to keep the Volkovs at bay. Leonardo murmured, his lips hovering mere inches from hers. But make no mistake, mia cara. The ring is real. The claim is real. You are mine now. And by the time this helicopter lands at my estate, you're going to realize that I have absolutely no intention of ever letting you go. The helicopter banked again, leaving the glittering skyline of Manhattan behind, plunging them into the deep, dark expanse over the Atlantic, toward a future Fiona could never have imagined. The Sikorsky S-76 touched down with a heavy mechanical thud on a floodlit helipad perched on the jagged cliffs of Montauk. The Atlantic Ocean raged below its dark waves, crashing against the rocks in a violent symphony that matched the chaotic drumming of Fiona's heart. As the rotors slowed, the heavy cabin doors slid open, letting in the sharp, salty tang of the sea breeze. Leonardo stepped out first, his imposing frame silhouetted against the stark security lights. He reached back his large hands, gripping Fiona's waist with that same possessive firmness, and lifted her down as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. Fiona looked up, her breath catching in her throat. Looming before them was a sprawling limestone fortress that looked less like a modern home and more like a modernized medieval castle. High walls, topped with discreet wrought-iron spikes, surrounded the perimeter, and Fiona could spot the red laser sights of security cameras tracking their every movement. Men in tactical gear armed with suppressed assault rifles patrolled the manicured grounds. This wasn't just a mansion. It was a heavily fortified command center. "Welcome to your new home, Fiona," Leonardo said, his hand sliding down to interlock his fingers with hers. "Leo, this is—" She struggled for the word. "Terrifying." A low rumble of a chuckle vibrated in his chest. "To the outside world, yes. To you it is the safest place on Earth." He led her through the massive mahogany front doors and into a grand foyer paved with imported Carrara marble. A towering crystal chandelier cast a warm golden glow over a dual sweeping staircase. Waiting at the base of the stairs was a small army of staff, led by an older woman in a pristine black dress with a severe bun and kind, watchful eyes. "Mrs. Bianchi." Leonardo addressed the older woman, his tone shifting from the ruthless Mafia Don to a respected employer. "This is Fiona. She is the future Mrs. Costa. You will extend to her the absolute authority and respect that you extend to me." Mrs. Bianchi didn't bat an eyelash at Fiona's disheveled hair or the cheap, straining fabric of the Macy's dress. She bowed her head deeply. "Welcome, Signorina Fiona. It is an honor. I will have the West Wing suites prepared immediately." "No." Leonardo interrupted his voice, dropping an octave. "She stays in the master suite, with me. Have Vincenzo bring up the security dossiers, and tell the kitchen to prepare something warm. She's had a long night." Before Fiona could protest the sleeping arrangements, Leonardo was already guiding her up the grand staircase. They walked down a long hallway, lined with classic Italian Renaissance art, stopping at heavy double doors, guarded by two massive men in tailored suits who nodded respectfully and stepped aside. The master suite was the size of Fiona's entire apartment building in Queens. It featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the tempestuous ocean, a massive king-sized bed draped in charcoal silk sheets, and a roaring fireplace. Leonardo walked to the center of the room, turning to face her. The adrenaline of the escape was fading, leaving Fiona feeling exposed and painfully aware of her appearance. She crossed her arms over her stomach, a defensive habit she had developed over 5 years of Cassian's relentless critiques. "Take that off," Leonardo commanded softly. Fiona froze. "What?" "The dress, Fiona. Take it off." He stepped closer, his dark eyes tracking the defensive way she held herself. "You've been pulling at that cheap fabric all night. It's scratching your skin, it's suffocating you. And it carries the stench of that pathetic lawyer's insults. I want it off you." "Leo, Fiona swallowed hard, her cheeks burning. "I don't look like Chloe. I don't look like the women who belong in places like this. Under this dress, I'm big. I have stretch marks. I have rolls. Cassian used to turn the lights off because he couldn't stand to look at. Do not speak his name in my bedroom." Leonardo's voice cracked like a whip, silencing her instantly. The raw fury in his eyes wasn't directed at her, but at the ghost of the man who had shattered her confidence. He closed the distance between them, gently prying her arms away from her stomach. His calloused fingers found the knot at the waist of her wrap dress. With a swift, deliberate tug, he untied it. Cassian is a weak, insecure boy who wanted a skeletal trophy he could control. Leonardo murmured, his knuckles brushing against the soft curve of her waist as he parted the emerald fabric. "I am a man, and a man knows that a queen requires substance." He pushed the dress off her shoulders. The cheap polyester pooled at her feet, leaving her standing only in her plain, sensible underwear. Fiona squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the urge to cover her stomach to hide her thick thighs. She waited for the hesitation, for the polite aversion of his gaze. Instead, she felt his hands. They were hot and firm, gripping her wide hips with a reverence that made her gasp. Leonardo dropped to his knees. Fiona's eyes flew open in shock. The most feared man on the eastern seaboard was kneeling before her. He pressed his face against the soft curve of her stomach, inhaling deeply before dragging his lips across her skin. "You are magnificent," he whispered against her flesh, his voice thick with unfeigned lust. "Every curve, every soft inch of you. You are a feast Fiona and I have been starving." He kissed the stretch marks on her hips, tracing them with his thumbs as if they were constellations in the night sky. He worshipped the body she had been taught to hate, dismantling 5 years of psychological abuse in 5 minutes of absolute, uncompromising devotion. When he finally stood, his eyes were dark and predatory, but filled with a tenderness that made her heart ache. Tomorrow I will fly in every designer from Milan and Paris. They will custom-fit silks and cashmeres to this body because off-the-rack garbage does not touch my wife. Leonardo promised, pulling her against his hard, muscular chest. But tonight you wear nothing. Tonight you are just mine. The next morning, the reality of the mafia underworld intruded violently upon the gilded sanctuary Leonardo had built. Fiona woke up tangled in expensive fret linens, the scent of Leonardo's cologne lingering on the pillows. The space beside her was empty, but the faint, tense murmur of voices drifted in from the adjacent private study. She wrapped herself in a thick, luxurious, monogrammed robe she found at the foot of the bed, and padded toward the cracked door. Inside the study, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Leonardo stood behind a massive mahogany desk, fully dressed in a black shirt and slacks, looking every inch the ruthless syndicate boss. Arrayed before him were 3 men, including Vincenzo Rossi, his viciously scarred underboss. Spread across the desk were satellite photos, blueprints, and a burning cigar resting in a heavy crystal ashtray. "The Volkovs are probing our perimeter," Vincenzo was saying, tapping a finger on a map of Queens. "Grigory Volkov isn't going to take the engagement announcement lightly. He knows she's the one who saved you in the alley, boss. He views her as a legitimate military target." Leonardo's jaw clenched, the pale scar on his temple standing out starkly against his tanned skin. "I want the security protocols doubled. Immediately." Vincenzo nodded, listing off the immediate directives. Total lockdown. No unvetted personnel are allowed within a 2-mile radius of the Montauk estate. Airspace restriction. The syndicate's private FAA contacts have grounded all unauthorized helicopter flights over the eastern tip of Long Island. Retaliation posture. Strike teams in Brooklyn and Little Odessa are armed and on standby, waiting for the green light to hit Volkov-owned shipping fronts. "We have a problem, Leonardo." Another capo spoke up, his voice grim. "It's about the bakery." Fiona pushed the door open, unable to hide anymore. "What about Sweet Haven?" All 4 men turned. The capos immediately lowered their eyes, showing absolute deference to the woman wearing their boss's ring. But Leonardo crossed the room in 3 long strides. He pulled her to his side, his arm wrapping protectively around her waist. "What happened to my bakery?" Fiona demanded, looking up into Leonardo's dark eyes. Leonardo sighed a heavy, dangerous sound. "Show her Vincenzo." Vincenzo hesitantly turned an iPad toward Fiona. On the screen was a live news feed from a local Queens station. The headline scrolled across the bottom in blaring red letters, "5-alarm blaze destroys beloved local bakery." The footage showed the charred, smoking ruins of Sweet Haven. The pink awning she had saved up for months to buy was melted to the sidewalk. The large glass windows were blown out. Firefighters were dousing the remaining embers of the place where Fiona had poured her blood, sweat, and tears for the last 6 years. Fiona's knees buckled. Leonardo caught her, instantly bearing her weight and pressing her face into his chest. "No." She sobbed, the devastation tearing through her. "No, my ovens, my recipes, my whole life was in there." "They hit it at 4 in the morning with Molotovs," Vincenzo reported quietly, stepping back to give them space. The fire department confirmed accelerant was used. Grigory Volkov left a message tagged on the brick wall of the alleyway. "A life for a life. The debt remains." "They burned it down just to send you a message." Fiona choked out, looking up at Leonardo, her vision blurred with angry tears. They destroyed my livelihood. They burned it because they are cowards who strike at empty buildings in the dead of night. Leonardo growled, his hand stroking her hair. I will rebuild it, Fiona. 10 times larger, 50 times more successful. You will have a culinary empire by the time I am done. Boss. Vincenzo interrupted, his voice dropping to a cautious whisper. There's more. The bakery's rear security gate. It wasn't breached by force. Someone gave the Volkovs the override code. The code only the owner and the staff knew. Fiona wiped her eyes, frowning in confusion. That's impossible. Only my 2 bakers, Maria and Rosa, had that code. They've been with me for years. They're like family. They would never— They didn't! Leonardo cut in, his voice dropping to a lethal, icy timbre. Who else knew the code, Fiona? She froze. The blood drained from her face as the realization hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. Cassian. Cassian. When they had been dating, he had demanded the code, claiming he needed a place to study later tonight where he wouldn't be disturbed. She hadn't changed it since he left, because she had been too heartbroken, too overwhelmed by debt to even think about the security system. We pulled the security feeds from a bodega across the street before the fire took it, Vincenzo confirmed grimly. A black Mercedes pulled up to the alley at 3:00 a.m. Cassian Pierce was in the passenger seat. He handed a slip of paper to Grigori's enforcers. In exchange, they handed him a thick manila envelope. Cash. Fiona felt sick. The betrayal was so profound, so deeply rooted, it transcended anger and settled into a hollow, aching void. Cassian hadn't just humiliated her at the gala. He had sold her out to the Russian mob to cover his own bespoke debts. He had actively aided in the destruction of the very business that had paid for his law degree. He sold me, Fiona whispered, the reality settling over her. He sold his own death warrant, Leonardo corrected softly. He released Fiona, turning back to his desk. The protective lover vanished, replaced instantly by the apex predator of the New York underworld. Vincenzo, Leonardo barked. Yes, boss. Find Cassian Pierce. I don't care if he's hiding in his law firm in Chloe Vanderpump's penthouse or in a rat hole in the Bronx. You find him and you bring him to the warehouse at the docks. Do not kill him. He belongs to me. And the Volkovs? Vincenzo asked, his eyes gleaming with anticipated violence. Leonardo picked up his gold lighter, snapping it open. The flame illuminated the merciless contour of his scarred face. Grigory Volkov touched what is mine. He burned my wife's sanctuary. Mobilize the strike teams, hit their shipping fronts, burn their warehouses, sink their vessels in the harbor. I want the sky, over Little Odessa, choked with smoke by nightfall. We are going to war. Fiona stood in the center of the study, the plush robe wrapped around her curvy frame. Yesterday she had been a struggling baker, crying over a cheap green dress. Today she was the catalyst for a mafia war, standing beside a man who was willing to burn down the city, to avenge her tears. Leonardo walked back to her, cupping her face in his hands. Do you trust me, Fiona? She looked at the burning intensity in his eyes, feeling the weight of the 10-carat diamond on her finger. Cassian had tried to make her feel small, insignificant, and disposable. Leonardo was making her the center of his violent, terrifying universe. Yes, she whispered fiercely. I trust you. Good. Leonardo smiled, a dark, terrifying expression. Then get dressed, Maya Regina. You and I are going to pay a visit to your ex-fiancé. The armored Mercedes Maybach glided silently into the cavernous, damp expanse of Pier 42 at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. The scent of saltwater rust and old blood permeated the air. Fiona stepped out of the vehicle, her cheap green polyester dress long gone. In its place, she wore a custom-tailored midnight black cashmere coat over a dark silk wrap dress that Leonardo had summoned from a private boutique just hours prior. The fabric draped flawlessly over her generous curves, hugging her waist and accentuating her full breasts and thick thighs with unapologetic elegance. She no longer looked like a victim. Walking beside Leonardo, whose terrifying presence seemed to command the very shadows of the warehouse, Fiona looked like a mafia queen stepping into a court. In the center of the concrete floor, illuminated by a single harsh halogen work light, sat a wooden chair. Bound to it, trembling so violently his teeth chattered, was Cassian Pierce. His Tom Ford tuxedo was ruined, torn at the shoulders, and stained with grease from the floor of whichever alley Vincenzo's men had dragged him out of. One of his eyes was swollen shut, and a thin line of blood trickled from his split lip. When he heard the sharp click of Fiona's heels echoing across the concrete, his good eye darted up. "Fiona!" Cassian gasped, his voice cracking in desperate relief. "Fiona, thank God. Tell these animals we used to be engaged. Tell them I'm a junior partner at Harrison and Wells. You have to stop this. They're crazy." Fiona stopped 10 feet away. She looked at the man she had loved, the man she had starved herself, for the man who had mocked her body in front of hundreds of people just 24 hours ago. He looked incredibly small. Leonardo stood shoulder to shoulder with her, his hands casually slipped into his trouser pockets. He didn't say a word. He was letting her take the lead. This was her reckoning. "They know exactly who you are, Cassian," Fiona said, her voice eerily calm, devoid of the tears she had shed the night before. "And they know what you did at 3 in the morning behind Sweet Haven." Cassian's face drained of the little color it had left. I don't know what you're talking about. The fire, Fiona, that's a tragedy. But I was at Chloe's penthouse all night. Do not lie to my wife." Leonardo's voice rumbled so low and lethal, it made the hairs on the back of Cassian's neck stand up. Vincenzo stepped forward from the shadows, casually tossing the manila envelope of Volkov cash onto Cassian's lap. Cassian stared at the bundles of $100 bills, and the last remnants of his arrogant facade crumbled. He began to hyperventilate. "Why, Cassian?" Fiona asked, stepping closer, the massive diamond on her finger catching the harsh light. "You already left me. You already got the heiress. Why sell out my bakery to the Russian mob? Why burn down the place that fed you when you had nothing?" "Because it wasn't just a bakery, Fiona." Cassian snapped a pathetic mixture of fear and his innate toxic condescension bleeding through. "You were always so stupidly blind. How do you think I paid off my student loans so fast? How do you think I afforded the down payment on the Tribeca condo before I even made partner?" Fiona frowned, a cold knot forming in her stomach. "What are you talking about?" "The commercial accounts," Leonardo interjected smoothly, his eyes fixed on Cassian like a hawk watching a dying mouse. "He was laundering money, using your business." Cassian let out a manic, sobbing laugh. "I was funneling Volkov Shell Company money through Sweet Haven's vendor accounts for 2 years. You never checked the ledgers, Fiona. You just baked your little cupcakes and smiled. But then the IRS started an audit on my firm. I panicked. I needed the paper trail gone, and the Volkovs needed to send Leonardo a message. It was a win-win. They gave me 50 grand and destroyed the financial records in one match." Fiona stared at him. The depth of his betrayal was a bottomless abyss. He hadn't just abandoned her. He had been using her as a criminal shield for years. He had engineered her financial ruin while sleeping in her bed and criticizing her weight. "And Chloe Vanderpump?" Leonardo asked, his tone dangerously conversational. Just a coincidence. Cassian swallowed hard. Her father owns the Atlantic shipping lanes. The Volkovs needed those lanes to bypass your docks, Costa. Marrying Chloe was the only way I could secure the contracts for Grigory Volkov. I did it for survival. I had to. Fiona felt a wave of absolute disgust wash over her. She didn't feel heartbroken anymore. She felt liberated. The man she had mourned never existed. You called me a stepping stone, Fiona said softly, leaning down so she was at eye level with him. You laughed at my dress. You called me fat and pathetic. But look at you, Cassian. You're just a parasite. A weak, desperate parasite, feeding off women because you have no real power of your own. Cassian sneered, his fear momentarily masked by his bruised ego. And you think this monster loves you? Look at yourself, Fiona. You're a whale. He's just using you to insult the Volkovs. Before Fiona could even react, Leonardo moved. It was a blur of terrifying, explosive violence. He grabbed Cassian by the hair, yanking his head back, and slammed his heavy fist directly into Cassian's jaw. The sickening crack of bone echoed loudly in the cavernous space. Cassian spat out blood and 3 teeth, sobbing hysterically. I told you, Leonardo whispered, pulling a gleaming, custom-forged stiletto blade from his jacket, pressing the flat of the cold steel against Cassian's trembling cheek. If anyone ever looks at her with anything less than worship, they lose their eyes. You have insulted my queen for the absolute last time. Leo. Fiona placed a gentle hand on Leonardo's forearm. The Mafia boss froze instantly, the bloodlust in his eyes tempering as he looked at her. Don't kill him, Fiona said, her voice steady. Cassian sobbed in relief. Thank you, Fiona, thank God. Killing him is too easy. Fiona interrupted her eyes, never leaving Cassian's terrified face. He's a lawyer. He loves his bespoke suits and his high society life. Take that away. Leonardo's lips curved into a slow, devastatingly cruel smile. He understood her perfectly. Vincenzo Leonardo commanded, stepping back and slipping his knife away. Bring the financial ledgers we recovered from his condo to the FBI, anonymously. I want him disbarred by Monday. Then break both of his hands. I want it so he can never hold a pen or tie a silk tie again. Cassian screamed, thrashing against his restraints. No, no, please, Costa, please. And then, Leonardo continued over the screaming, drop him off in Little Odessa. Let Grigory Volkov know that his little lawyer confessed everything and failed to secure the Vanderpump shipping lanes. I'm sure the Russians will be thrilled to see him. Fiona turned her back on Cassian as Vincenzo and 2 enforcers stepped forward with heavy steel pipes. She didn't flinch at the sound of the first bone shattering, nor the agonizing scream that followed. She simply walked out of the warehouse into the cool night air, leaving her past in the darkness where it belonged. Leonardo walked out a moment later, draping his jacket over her shoulders. He pulled her thick, soft body against his side, kissing the top of her head. The Volkovs are next, Leonardo promised into her hair. By tomorrow there won't be a Russian syndicate left in New York. And after that? Fiona asked, looking up at him. After that? Leonardo smiled. We bake. 1 year later, the grand opening of La Regina the Queen was the most exclusive ticket in Manhattan. Situated in a sprawling multi-million-dollar corner property in Tribeca, the culinary empire was a masterpiece of Venetian glass imported marble, and the intoxicating aroma of spun, sugar-rich espresso and baking bread. There was a line wrapping around 3 city blocks. Food critics from the New York Times and Michelin inspectors mingled with A-list celebrities and politicians, all clamoring for a taste of the legendary pastries. In the opulent private VIP suite overlooking the main floor, Fiona Costa stood in front of a floor-to-ceiling mirror. She took her own breath away. She was wearing a custom-designed Dolce & Gabbana gown in deep, venomous crimson. The heavy silk was masterfully tailored to celebrate every inch of her plus-sized figure. It cinched tightly at her waist, pushed up her cleavage, and draped heavily over her wide hips and thick thighs. A slit up the side revealed a strappy Christian Louboutin heel. Around her neck rested a string of flawless diamonds that matched the massive emerald-cut engagement ring which now sat securely next to a thick platinum wedding band. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was magnificent, and she knew it. "You look absolutely devastating, Mia Mowgli," a dark velvet voice murmured from the doorway. Fiona smiled, turning, as Leonardo locked the heavy mahogany door behind him. He looked dangerously handsome in a bespoke black tuxedo, the pale scar on his cheek only adding to his rugged, untouchable aura. The Costa Syndicate was now the undisputed singular power on the East Coast. The Volkovs had been systematically dismantled and eradicated in a brutal 3-week shadow war. Grigory Volkov was dead, and Cassian Pierce. The last rumor Fiona had heard was that a disbarred, crippled man matching his description was seen begging for change near a subway grate in the Bronx, entirely unrecognizable. Leonardo crossed the room, his eyes dark with predatory hunger. He didn't care about the A-listers waiting downstairs. He only cared about the woman in front of him. He pulled Fiona flush against his chest. His large hands immediately dropped to grip her lush, full hips, squeezing the soft flesh through the expensive silk. "Do you know how hard it is for me to let other men look at you tonight?" Leonardo growled playfully, pressing open-mouthed kisses along her jawline, moving down to the sensitive skin of her neck. "They look at you, and I want to gouge their eyes out." "You are a goddess, Fiona." Fiona tipped her head back, letting out a soft sigh as his hands roamed over her stomach, worshipping the curves she had once been so desperate to shrink. "They can look all they want, Leo. But I only belong to the man who burned down half the city for me." Leonardo chuckled a dark, vibrating sound against her skin. He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. The ruthless Mafia Don was completely helplessly devoted to her. "I would burn the rest of the world to ash if you asked me to. Your bakery is a triumph. You have conquered New York." "We conquered it," Fiona corrected, softly, reaching up to trace the scar on his cheek. "I'm not a stepping stone anymore." "No," Leonardo agreed, dropping to one knee before her, just as he had done on their very first night in Montauk. He pressed his face against her soft, silk-covered stomach, kissing the very center of her body with religious reverence. "You are the throne." He stood back up, offering her his arm. "Are you ready to face your kingdom, Mrs. Costa?" Fiona looked at her reflection one last time. She saw the stretch marks faintly visible through the slit of the dress, the roundness of her face, the thickness of her arms. She saw power. She saw beauty. She saw a woman who had been loved back to life by a monster who treated her like a queen. "Let's go." Fiona smiled, slipping her hand through his arm. The heavy doors opened, and together the King and Queen of New York descended the marble staircase into the blinding flash of cameras ready to devour the world. And that is how a cheap green dress became the catalyst for the greatest mafia empire New York had ever seen. Fiona's journey proves that true power and beauty don't fit into a sample size, and the right man will worship the very ground you walk on and destroy anyone who tries to tear you down. Karma came for Cassian in the most brutal way possible. What did you think of Leonardo's ultimate revenge? Let us know in the comments below. If you loved this story of vengeance, romance and fierce curves, smash that like button, share with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more intense, dramatic stories. See you in the next video.